Part I. The Doppler effect. Seattle, November 1974. The rain in Seattle wasn't weather, it was a frequency. A constant, low-fidelity hiss that coated the city in gray static. Caleb Wright sat inside a modified 1969 Ford Econoline van parked under the rusted girders of the Ballard Bridge. The back of the van smelled of stale coffee, ozone, and hot dust burning off vacuum tubes. To the outside world, it was a plumber's work truck. Inside, it was a cathedral of copper and magnetic tape. Caleb adjusted the gain on a heavy Akai GX4 OD reel-to-reel recorder. He was 32, with pale skin that hadn't seen direct sunlight in months and fingers stained yellow from nicotine and flux. He wore bulky headphones, his eyes closed, listening to the invisible pulse of the city. Signal check, he whispered into a microphone. 3 miles away, in a smoky betting parlor on First Avenue, a man named Mickey stood by a payphone, pretending to read a racing form. Mickey was the muscle, or rather, the legs. Caleb was the brain. Loud and clear, Mickey's voice crackled through Caleb's earpiece. Stand by. The Longacres signal is live. The loop. The scam was technically elegant and physically simple. The betting shops in Seattle didn't get their race results via telephone wire. That was too expensive for the smaller joints. They relied on a dedicated FM radio subcarrier broadcast from the track. It was fast, efficient, and unsecured. Caleb had built a repeater. A high-gain antenna on the roof of his van intercepted the signal from the racetrack. Before it reached the city repeaters, the signal went down a wire into Caleb's first tape deck, which recorded it onto magnetic tape. Here was the magic. The tape didn't just spoil onto a reel. It traveled across a series of rollers, stretching 6 feet across the wall of the van, before feeding into a second machine, the playback deck. The playback deck then blasted the signal back out through a high-power transmitter, overpowering the weak original signal in the neighborhood. The physical distance the tape traveled between the record head and the play head created a delay, exactly 90 seconds. To the betting shop, the radio broadcast sounded live. The announcer was screaming, the crowd was cheering, but in reality, the horses had already crossed the finish line a minute and a half ago. The race, and they're off. The announcer's voice boomed in Caleb's headphones, the real signal, the live one. Caleb watched the tape spin. The brown ribbon of information moved hypnotically from left to right. He was holding time in his hands. Gates open, Caleb said calmly to Mickey. Don't move yet. On the radio, the announcer was calling the positions. Midnight Runner was in the lead. Salty Dog was fading. Caleb waited. He watched the seconds tick by on his stopwatch. Coming down the stretch, the real announcer screamed, "It's Red Baron on the outside. Red Baron by a nose." The race was over. Caleb checked the tape loop. The delayed signal, the one the betting shop was listening to, was still at the starting gate. The horses hadn't even reached the first turn in the bookie's reality. Winner is number 4. Red Baron, Caleb said. Odds are 8-1. Go. The bet in the betting parlor. The radio crackled. And they're coming around the first bend. The patrons, old men with cigars and raincoats, were glued to the speaker. Mickey walked up to the counter. He looked bored. He slapped a stack of wet $20 bills on the counter. 500 on number 4, Mickey said. The bookie, a guy named Sal with a scar over his eye, laughed. Late bet, Mickey. The race already started. Windows open until the halfway mark. Sal, you know the rules. Sal shrugged and punched the ticket. Your funeral. Red Baron is a donkey. Mickey took the ticket. He walked back to the payphone and lit a cigarette. 45 seconds later, the radio announcer, Caleb's delayed ghost, started screaming. And here comes Red Baron. Look at him fly. Sal's jaw dropped. The cigar fell out of his mouth. The tear in the fabric back in the van. Caleb watched the tape finish its journey. He let the broadcast play out until the payout confirmation. Then, he flipped a switch. Click. The transmitter died. The local signal vanished, replaced instantly by the real station signal, which was now playing a commercial for car tires. The transition was seamless. Caleb exhaled. He felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the damp cold. It wasn't about the money Mickey would bring him his cut later. It was about the power. He had sliced a minute and a half out of reality, held it, used it, and stitched it back together. He rewound the tape. The sound of the race played backward. A high-pitched squeal of meaningless noise. Project Doppler successful. He logged in a notebook. He reached for a soldering iron. He needed to improve the signal-to-noise ratio. Next time, they would go for the trifecta. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the metal roof of the van. High above, invisible radio waves crisscrossed the city, carrying secrets, lies, and money. And Caleb Wright was the only one listening to the silence between them. Part E. The Blue Box, Oregon. October 1975. The Starlight Motel sat on a lonely stretch of Highway 101, battered by the Pacific winds. The neon sign burst with a dying insect sound. Star Height. No vacancy. Room 104 was a shrine to beige wallpaper and cigarette burns. Caleb Wright sat on the edge of the sagging bed. The curtains were drawn. On the nightstand, next to a rotary telephone, sat a small plastic device the size of a cigarette pack. It was clumsy, homemade, wrapped in blue electrical tape. It had a keypad salvaged from a calculator, and a speaker taken from a greeting card. This was the key to the kingdom, the blue box. Caleb picked up the motel phone receiver. He dialed a toll-free 800 number, a car rental company in Chicago. "Thank you for calling Hertz. How may I?" Caleb brought the blue box to the mouthpiece and pressed a button. Keep. A sharp, piercing tone at exactly 2600 Hz blasted down the line. The automated trunk line at, and he heard that pitch and instinctively obeyed. It was the frequency of silence, the signal that told the massive switching computers, "The call is over, reset the line, but keep the channel open." The operator in Chicago vanished. The line went dead, then gave a chirping kerchunk. Caleb was now floating in the tandem, the empty space between the world's telephone networks. He was a ghost in the machine. He punched a new sequence into his box. KP-1-555-019-Saint. He wasn't calling a person. He was rerouting the routing table itself. The corridor were in position. A gruff voice echoed in Caleb's ear. It was a man named Miller, calling from a payphone in a Portland jewelry district alleyway. "Hold on," Caleb said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I'm scrubbing the local exchange." Caleb's fingers danced over the blue box. He wasn't just making a free call. He was executing a looparound. He was instructing the Portland Telephone Exchange to treat any incoming calls to the police precinct in that specific grid as line busy. "The corridor is open," Caleb said. "You have 6 minutes before the reroute trace kicks in. If anyone dials 911 in that block, they're getting a busy signal. Go." He set the receiver down on the pillow, but he didn't hang up. He lit a cigarette. This was his business now. He didn't bet on horses anymore. He sold silence. He sold the absence of police. He was the god of the gap, the man who decided whether a cry for help was heard or ignored. The glitch. He listened to the ambient noise of the open line. He could hear Miller breathing. He heard the shattering of glass distant, tinny, like a radio play. "Grab the trays. Move," Miller shouted. Caleb checked his watch. 3 minutes left. Easy money. $5,000 waiting in a locker at the Greyhound station. Then, the tone changed. "Please, no." A woman's voice. High, terrified. A shop clerk. "Shut up, lady," Miller roared. Caleb frowned. The deal was clean. No engagement. Smash and grab. "I said don't touch the alarm, Mang." The sound was shockingly loud over the receiver. It clipped the audio range of the phone line, turning into a distorted crack of static. Then silence. "Miller," Caleb whispered. "Damn it." Miller's voice was breathless. She reached for it. "I had to. Let's go. Go." Weeping. He could hear the woman weeping, then a gurgling sound, then nothing. Caleb stared at the phone. The smoke from his cigarette curled up into the yellowed ceiling light. He had just facilitated a murder. He hadn't pulled the trigger, but he had cut the wire that connected that woman to safety. He had built the room in which she died. His hand shook. He grabbed the receiver to slam it down, to break the connection. Click. But before the line went dead, he heard something else. A faint, rhythmic clicking sound underneath the chaos. Click dash pause dash click dash click. It wasn't part of the robbery. It was on the line. Someone else was in the tandem. Listening. San Francisco. FCC Field Officer Sarah Jenkins sat in a dark room illuminated by the green glow of an oscilloscope. She adjusted the frequency dial. The green wave on the screen spiked. "I got him," she muttered. He disconnected. Her partner, a weary federal agent named Boyd, looked over her shoulder. "Got who?" "The Portland shooters." "No," Sarah said, tapping the screen. "The Phantom. The guy who opened the door for them. I tracked the 2600 Hz reset pulse. It didn't come from Portland. It bounced off a trunk in Sacramento. But the origin." She drew a line on a map with a grease pencil. "The origin is coastal Oregon. Somewhere on Highway 101. That's a lot of haystack, Sarah." "He made a mistake," Sarah said, her eyes narrowing. "He stayed on the line too long. He listened." "Voyeur." She put on her headset. "Get the mobile direction finding unit ready. We're going north. If he uses that blue box again, I'll know exactly which motel room he's rotting in." The disconnect. Caleb ripped the blue box out of the wall jack. He threw it into his duffel bag. He was breathing hard, sweating despite the chill of the room. The sound of that gunshot, the distorted crack, was stuck in his head on a loop. He packed his gear in 30 seconds. He wiped the phone down with a towel. He ran out to the Econoline van. The rain was torrential now. He fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling. He wasn't a god anymore. He was an accomplice. And for the first time, he felt the terrifying sensation of eyes, or rather, ears on him. He started the engine and peeled out onto the wet highway, driving south, into the dark. He needed to disappear, but he didn't know that he was driving straight toward the woman who was hunting him. Part E. The Voice of God. San Francisco. November 1977. The fog rolled over Twin Peaks like a slow, suffocating tide, burying the lights of San Francisco in a glowing white haze. Parked on a gravel turnout overlooking the city was the Ford Econoline. It looked different now. The rusted white paint was covered in dark gray primer. Inside, it was a spaceship. Caleb Wright sat amidst a wall of blinking LEDs and meters. He was older, his face gaunt, hidden behind a thick beard. He wasn't running scams anymore. Since Oregon, since the dead woman on the phone, he had been trying to balance the ledger. He was listening to the police band. CHANNEL 4. Suspects are barricaded in the vaults area. A frantic voice crackled over the speaker. "We have 6 civilians, 1 wounded." Down in the Mission District, the Bank of America branch was surrounded by flashing red lights. A botched robbery. Amateurs with nervous fingers and heavy calibers. Caleb watched the audio waveform dance on his oscilloscope. He adjusted a knob on a heavy, rack-mounted device, a custom-built vocoder paired with a frequency modulator. "Captain," the radio voice continued, "they're threatening to execute a hostage if we don't pull the cruisers back." "Hold your positions," came the reply. It was Captain Miller, the on-scene commander. His voice was gravelly, distinct, shouting over the wind. Caleb pressed a key on his synthesizer. He sampled Miller's voice. He isolated the pitch, the timbre, the specific cadence of his anger. Caleb wasn't just listening tonight. He was directing. The override sniper team. "Do you have a line?" Captain Miller asked on the real frequency. "Negative, Captain. The windows are painted over. We're blind." "All right." Miller's voice tense. "We can't wait. Alpha team, prepare to breach the front doors on my mark. Gas and go." Flashbangs out. Caleb's hands flew across his console. Breach the front. It was a suicide run. The robbers were watching the front. The hostages would be caught in the crossfire. It would be Oregon all over again. Not tonight, Caleb whispered. He flipped 3 switches. His massive transmitter, powered by a cluster of stolen car batteries, hummed to life. He tuned it to exactly 460.0 to 5 MHz, the police tactical channel. But he didn't just transmit. He used phase cancellation. He broadcasted an inverted signal of the real dispatch carrier wave, effectively silencing the real radio traffic for anyone within 2 miles, creating a hole in the airwaves that only he could fill. He pressed the microphone button. He spoke, but his voice didn't come out as Caleb Wright. It came out processed, deepened, and roughened by the vocoder. Alpha Team, belay that order. The voice on the police radios boomed. It sounded exactly like Captain Miller, just clearer, authoritative, godlike. Cancel frontal breach. Repeat, cancel breach. Down on the street, the SWAT team froze, lowering their rams. I have eyes on the rear alley. Caleb continued, using the Miller voice print. Thermal shows suspects moving to the back loading dock. Shift containment to the south alley. Trap them there. Do not enter the building. It was a lie. Caleb didn't have thermal vision. He had logic. He knew the robbers would try the back way if the front stayed quiet. The ghost in the machine 3 miles away. Inside an unmarked van filled with government-issue electronics. Sarah Jenkins grabbed her headphones. Did you hear that? She snapped at Agent Boyd. Hear what? Miller changed his mind. Look at the scope. Sarah pointed to the green line jittering violently. That's not a natural transmission. The background static. It's perfectly flat. Someone just heterodyned the frequency. They jammed the real signal and replaced it. You're saying that wasn't Miller? I'm saying someone is impersonating the police commander from a high-power source. Sarah spun the dials on her direction finder. The signal is strong. It's coming from the high ground. Twin Peaks. Is he helping the robbers? Sarah listened to the radio. Suspects are exiting the rear. We have them. Get down, get down. The police radio erupted in cheers and the sounds of handcuffs clicking. The robbers had walked right into the ambush Caleb had set. The hostages were safe inside. Sarah sat back, stunned. No, she whispered. He just caught them. He saved the hostages. A vigilante? Boyd asked. A conductor, Sarah said. She looked at the map. He's playing God with the radio. But he just gave away his position. Start the car. We're going up the hill. The escaped Caleb watched the arrest unfold through his binoculars from the hilltop. He saw the hostages walking out, alive. He felt a rush of dopamine, sharper and cleaner than any money he'd ever stolen. He had rewritten the script. He had saved them. Then, the red light on his scanner started blinking. Proximity alert. A signal was sweeping the hill. A directional beacon. FCC. Caleb cursed. They were faster than before. He killed the power. The hum of the transmitter died. The van plunged into darkness. He scrambled into the driver's seat. He couldn't take the main road down, they would block it. He had to take the fire trail. The dirt path that dropped down the backside of the peaks into the fog. As he turned the key, he saw headlights sweep across the gravel turnout where he had been parked seconds ago. A black sedan screeched to a halt. Caleb gunned the engine, the heavy van sliding in the mud, plunging into the thick white mist. He was safe for tonight. But Sarah Jenkins had seen his trick. She knew he wasn't just a thief anymore. He was dangerous because he was righteous. And a righteous man makes mistakes. He drove into the silence, knowing the next time he keyed the mic, it might be the last thing he ever did. Part of the Dead Zone, Northern California. Highway 101. October 1978. The redwoods were ancient, towering pillars of silence that swallowed radio waves. Under the canopy of the Avenue of the Giants, there was no TV reception, no AM radio, no police chatter, just the sound of dripping water and the roar of the wind in the branches. Caleb Wright's van was parked down a logging road, hidden beneath a fern-covered embankment. The van had evolved again. It was no longer just a transmitter, it was a fortress of solitude. Caleb had lined the entire interior walls, ceiling, floor with fine copper mesh. He had grounded the chassis to the earth with a metal spike driven into the mud. He had built a Faraday cage on wheels. Inside, Caleb sat in the dark. He couldn't turn on his active scanners, because the local oscillator coils leaked faint RF energy that a sensitive enough detector could spot. He was deaf and blind, relying on a battery-operated shortwave receiver with a passive Y antenna strung up in a tree. He was starving. His cash reserves from the betting scams were gone, spent on vacuum tubes and gasoline. He had one account left, a stash in a Cayman shell corporation, accessible only via a data link terminal in San Francisco. But he couldn't go back to the city. He had to move the money remotely. And to do that, he had to scream into the void. The Hunter's Net 30 miles south, at a roadside diner in Garberville. Sarah Jenkins stared at a topographical map spread over a plate of cold eggs. She looked exhausted. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her blouse wrinkled. "He's in the dead zone," she said, tapping a blank spot on the map where the contour lines got tight. Agent Boyd swallowed his coffee. "We've been driving up and down 101 for a week, Sarah. No signals. Maybe he ditched the van. Maybe he's in Mexico." "He's not in Mexico," Sarah said, her voice tight. "He's an addict, Boyd. Not to drugs, but to the current. He needs to know he's still connected. And he's broke. I checked his known drops. Empty." She pulled a device from her bag. It looked like a Geiger counter, but it measured electromagnetic noise floor. "He's hiding in the noise. But eventually, he has to come up for air. He has to make a transaction. And when he does," she drew a red circle on a repeater tower on a nearby ridge, "he'll need a line of sight to a microwave relay. We don't hunt the van anymore. We hunt the repeater." The burst. Caleb checked his equipment. He had built a burst encoder. In 1978, data transmission was slow. 300 baud modems that sang a slow, screeching song. Caleb didn't have the time for a long call, so he had recorded the necessary modem tones, the handshake, the account number, the transfer command onto a high-speed tape deck. He planned to transmit the recording at 10x speed over a ham radio frequency to a receiver he'd hidden in the city weeks ago, which would slow it down and feed it into the phone line. It was a desperation move, a fraction of a second of noise. He climbed out of the van into the rain. He manually cranked a telescopic mast, raising a yogi-directional antenna toward the south ridge. He ran back inside. He powered up the main transmitter. The tubes glowed orange, warming the damp air. The hum was deafening in the silence of the woods. 3, 2, 1. Caleb flipped the switch. Scree-ch. The transmission lasted 0.8 seconds. A violent tear in the radio silence. He immediately killed the power. He waited, heart hammering against his ribs. The ping in the diner parking lot, inside the FCC surveillance truck. A needle on a spectrum analyzer jumped and pinned itself to the right. Beep. Sarah dropped her coffee cup. It shattered on the asphalt. Bearing 330. She screamed, diving into the truck. Signal strength massive. It was a burst. "He's right on top of us." She grabbed the radio mic. "All units, triangulation confirmed. Sector 4, the logging road off mile marker 44. Seal the highway." The run. Caleb was already moving. He didn't wait to see if the transfer worked. He felt the exposure like a physical burn. He started the engine. The Ford Econoline roared, tires spinning in the mud. He tore out of the logging road, fishtailing onto the asphalt of Highway 101. He looked in the rearview mirror. Nothing. Then, a mile back, blue lights crested the hill. Then another set. Then a helicopter broke through the low clouds, its spotlight stabbing the gloom. They were waiting, Caleb realized. She knew. He couldn't outrun a helicopter in a heavy van. He couldn't hide in the woods anymore. He had played a defensive game, and he had lost. He looked at the fuel gauge. Quarter tank. He looked at the map taped to his dashboard. The highway wound south, back toward the city, back toward the Golden Gate. But to the east was the Sutro Tower, the massive, three-legged metal giants that dominated the San Francisco skyline, the highest antenna in the state, the nervous system of the entire Bay Area. Caleb's eyes hardened. He didn't want the money anymore. The money was just one south and no south. If he was going to burn, he was going to take the fire with him. He was going to turn up the volume so loud that it would deafen the whole world. He cranked the steering wheel, turning off the highway onto the steep, winding access road that led up the mountain. One last broadcast, he whispered. Part V. White Noise, San Francisco, Sutro Tower. November 1979. The storm of the decade was hammering the Bay Area. Lightning arced across the sky, turning the night into a strobe-lit nightmare. High above the city, the Sutro Tower stood like a three-legged iron colossus, its red warning lights blinking in the rain. It was the highest point in San Francisco, the needle that injected television and radio into the veins of a million homes. Caleb Wright drove the Econoline van through the chain-link fence at the base of the tower. He didn't bother with the gate. The heavy bumper tore through the metal mesh. He parked directly beneath the central leg. The hum here was physical, a vibration that rattled teeth. Megawatts of power flowed through thick conduits above him. Caleb jumped out into the rain. He dragged a thick, shielded cable from the back of his van. He wasn't running away anymore. He was plugging in the feedback loop. He smashed the lock on the maintenance panel of the main transmission trunk. Inside were copper bus bars as thick as a man's arm. This was the arterial vein of the city's information. Caleb clamped his cable onto the bars. Sparks showered down, burning holes in his jacket. He didn't flinch. He ran back to the van and locked the doors. Inside, the equipment was screaming. The needles on his VU meters were pinned in the red. Integration complete, he whispered. His plan was insane. He wasn't just broadcasting. He was setting up a standing wave. He programmed his synthesizer to emit a tone that was the exact inverse frequency of the tower's carrier wave, but amplified by the tower's own power source. It would create a feedback loop, a massive electromagnetic pulse of pure, destructive resonance. It wouldn't hurt people, but magnetic tape, hard drives, the banking mainframes in the financial district, they would be wiped clean. A magnetic bleach poured over the city's memory. He began to turn the master gain knob. The hum inside the van rose to a shriek. The confrontation, a spotlight hit the windshield. Sarah Jenkins stood outside in the rain, flanked by two armed federal agents. She held a megaphone. Caleb Wright. Her voice was tiny against the wind. Step out of the vehicle. It's over. Caleb looked at her. He picked up his microphone. He flipped a switch that routed his voice not to the airwaves, but to the power system on Sarah's own car. It's not over, Sarah. His voice boomed from her own speakers, distorted and godlike. It's just time to clear the tape. Sarah signaled the agents to hold fire. She walked closer to the van. She saw the cables. She looked up at the tower, then back at him. She understood the physics. If you throw that switch, she shouted, abandoning the megaphone, you'll create a ground fault. You're sitting in the center of the arc. You'll cook yourself alive. Caleb smiled sadly behind the glass. He picked up a cassette tape from the dash's favorite recording of rain. He put it in the deck. The signal-to-noise ratio is too high down here, Sarah, he said over the PAL. I need some silence. The drop, he slammed the master fader to maximum. For a microsecond, there was no sound. The air ionization sucked the breath out of the clearing. Then, the sky turned white. A massive arc of blue electricity jumped from the tower's structure to the van. The feedback loop kicked in. The Sutro Tower didn't transmit TV shows or news that night. It transmitted a pulse of raw magnetic violence. In the financial district, miles away, alarm bells rang in server rooms as tape reels spun wildly and erased themselves. In the police archives, audio evidence dissolved into static. In every living room in San Francisco, televisions exploded in a burst of snow. The van glowed like a filament in a light bulb. The windows shattered outwards. Then, the main transformer on the ridge blew. Boom. Darkness. Absolute, crushing darkness swallowed the hill. The hum stopped. The rain was the only sound left. Epilogue. The static 6 months later, Sarah Jenkins walked through the charred remains of the van, which had been towed to an impound lot. The interior was gutted by fire. The equipment was fused into lumps of plastic and metal. They never found a body. The coroner said the heat of the arc flash would have vaporized organic matter instantly. Others said he might have slipped out the back hatch in the split second of blindness. Before the explosion, it didn't matter. Caleb Wright ceased to exist. Sarah opened the glove compartment, which had been fused shut. She pried it open with a screwdriver. Inside, miraculously shielded by the layers of lead Caleb had installed, was a single cassette tape. She put it in her pocket. Later that night, in her apartment, she put the tape into her player. She expected a confession, or a manifesto. She pressed play. For 10 minutes, there was nothing. Just a low, steady hiss. Sarah leaned back, closing her eyes. It wasn't empty tape. It was a recording of pink noise, a frequency spectrum used to tune rooms, to mask imperfections, to create calm. It was the sound of a clean slate. The city had rebuilt its data. The banks had restored their backups from off-site vaults. The world had moved on to digital, leaving the analog ghosts behind. But every now and then, when the fog was thick and the radio reception was bad, people in San Francisco swore they could hear a voice in the static, counting down numbers for a race that had already finished. Sarah turned off the light and listened to the silence. The end,